Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'll be talking about our paper on investigating the third dimension for authentication in immersive virtual reality and in the real world. So authentication in virtual reality is becoming necessary. We are spending more and more time in virtual reality, and there are applications available where we can do in-game purchases, shopping experiences, and social spaces where we have to identify ourselves. And the more time we spend with these devices, the more important it is to design authentication concepts that are usable and secure. We know from other contexts that an all-in-one solution where you authenticate at the beginning does not work and is not secure. Especially when with HMDs that are shared among family members and co-workers, this solution doesn't work for a long-term usage. Here's an example I found just Googling. This is from the Google Cardboard, but it shows really nicely that currently there are issues with the authentication process. So it says here, after you press OK, you need to take off your headset and confirm the purchase directly on the phone screen. We don't want this to happen for HMD usage because we believe that taking the headset off splits the experience, breaks the presence and immersion, and it also shows to the bystander, so people who are in the real world and observing either actively or inactively, that you're making an authentication when you're taking off the headset. And simultaneously, HMD devices are becoming self-contained, so we don't have an external keyboard or a display where we can enter any additional information. So what we're working towards is a seamless authentication concept for VR. And we believe a two-step authentication or a two-factor authentication, similar to entering a PIN or pattern or on a mobile phone, is something that would work for HMD usage as well when you authenticate. And this two-factor authentication is basically the concept of something that you have, which is your HMD device, and something that you know, which is the password then itself. Another concept that is important for this project that I want to introduce you to is shoulder surfing. So shoulder surfing is when someone looks over your shoulders and it basically overlooks what you're doing. For example, when you enter a PIN or a password on your mobile phone. And from research on mobile devices, we know that users are aware of shoulder surfers and that they're disturbed by them. And in contrast to mobile devices, HMD users are, of course, also blinded from the real world, and we know that they're anxious about other people watching them. So in the context of this paper, we want to understand how much of a threat shoulder surfing is for 3D authentication. There is a lot of prior work in usable security for mobile devices and some in 3D environments. I'm just picking out 3 pieces that I'd like you to know that influenced us, but there is more work in our paper. So there is Al-Suleiman's work. They looked into 3-dimensional passwords for secure authentication. This is basically a 3D environment that you navigate with a mouse on a PC. And you can basically walk through the 3D environment, sit down, for example, on a chair, navigate with the computer, etc. And all of these interactions then form a password. Then there's this concept by GoreRe in 2017. They use an HMD, and they also have a 3D environment, but they navigate it with Xbox 360 controllers. And it's the same thing. The interactions form a password. We have also done some prior work in this area with an HMD device, but we try to see what the outcomes are when we just transfer established concepts like pins and patterns into the 3D environment. And we did this with a Vive controller and a HTC Vive. So based on the prior work, what we wanted to do is we wanted to see whether we can use the special properties that the 3D environment offers to make authentication more usable and secure. So basically seeing whether we can improve the entry times and the error rates that these prior systems have provided, and whether we can also make it secure, so robust against shoulder surfing. And we also wanted to see whether we can transfer this concept into the real world, for example, for smart home authentication. So you can imagine it's also a 3D environment. You have smart devices, and you authenticate by interacting with these smart devices, basically. So going away from having the phone only to authenticate with your smart devices. So based on prior work, we came up with a number of design guidelines for what this authentication concept could look like, and we've called it room lock. And what we did is basically we have this room that we replicated from a real world room, and we completed, you have virtual objects within this room, and you create a password by pointing in that room on these virtual objects. And we decided to point rather than interact because for it to be usable and comparable to pin and pattern entry, it needs to be quick as well. So entry times need to be low. For this study, we decided to take everyday objects because we thought it would be more relatable for non-expert users when they come in. Okay, so what we did is we had 4 user studies, a usability study, a memorability study, and 2 security studies that look at 2 different threat models. In the usability study, we, of course, had the real world and the virtual world that we wanted to compare, but we also had an independent variable called randomization. Here we wanted to see whether changing the positions every time where the user starts authenticating within the room would improve security, so someone watching from the outside, whether they can, whether they can understand what the user is entering just by watching their gestures. And we also wanted to see whether object randomization, so where the objects are placed at different places every time the user authenticates, would also improve security. And as I mentioned, we measure here entry time, error rate, and we also did a workload questionnaire. For the security study, we had a post-hoc attack, which is basically where you watch videos afterwards and guess the password, and you have an immediate attack where the user enters a password, takes off the headset, and then the attacker puts on the headset and tries to enter the password. So our results basically show that in the baseline, so without any randomization, it took users about 8.5 seconds to authenticate, and the object randomization was not good at all, so the user randomization was also comparable. But from prior work, so comparing this to prior work actually shows that these entry times are much higher. So prior work is usually around 3 seconds for pattern entry and also for pattern entry in VR itself, it's around 3 seconds, but here it's around 8.5 seconds. But if we look closer at the data, we can see actually for room lock and for 3D authentication with pointing, there is a training effect, a really high training effect. So we believe that over a longer period of time, people will actually get quicker when they authenticate. And in the third round, they only took 6.3 seconds, which is getting closer to the 3 seconds where we actually want to get to with the pattern entry. And what I'm not going to go into the details because of time, but the error rates are also much lower for room-lock than for comparable pattern and entry in the real world and in virtual reality. What's also interesting is that compared to the real world, where people authenticated with these 3D objects, the times were much slower. So in the baseline, it only took them 4.8 seconds to authenticate. And we didn't find any workload differences between the two worlds. So the shoulder surfing results, we are only going to go into details on the immediate attack, so where people took off their headsets and the other person authenticated immediately after them. For room lock, it was 12.5 without randomization and 18 with randomization, and 12.5 is much lower. In the paper, you can find some attack techniques, which were interesting. The memorability was really good. So 21 out of 27 participants who responded 1 week later got it 100% right. Some limitations. I'm running out of time. So in future work, what we want to look is, as I mentioned, we haven't looked at what the effects are over a longer period of time. We want to look at the transferability to AR. We want to look at additional parameters. I mean, the 3D space offers a lot of parameters, the object size. It's possible to personalize in the 3D space, so to have rooms that are personalized to each user. And we want to look at alternative input techniques such as gaze. And we want to create a smart home prototype. So one that really works for the real world. Thanks.
So I'm curious, so approaches like this will work when the thing that is presenting the environment, it's okay for them to understand what you're doing. So if you're unlocking a device or entering a password into an app. But if you're doing authentication of a secondary thing, like if I'm using my Facebook to log into another app and I don't want that app to know my password, right? So on desktop or something, we would normally pop up a box that I recognize as the Facebook input box. But if everything is being presented by an app in 3D, all of that can be spoofed. And so an app could convince you to enter your PayPal password or your Facebook password. Do you have any thoughts on how in an environment like VR you can avoid the spoofing problem so users recognize when it's a real password authentication request versus something that might not be?
That's a very interesting question.
I'd be happy to chat with you afterwards if you'd like.
Yeah, I think let's chat afterwards, because we have some follow-up projects that we're also doing in this area, because in this project we're focusing a lot on the bystander and the effects on the bystander. But yeah, if it's okay, we can chat afterwards, because I think I need to think about it.
Yeah, this is a huge issue for us in the web community, because there's a lot of authentication and there's no browser Chrome in VR. And we don't know how to do it either, so I'd love to get ideas.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Excellent.